Left, Right and Centre. I'm Nidhi Razdan. Tonight our big focus is the state of the economy. The latest GDP numbers came out just a little while earlier and the economy has shown an uptick in this quarter with the GDP growth rate at 6.3%, up from 5.7% in the last quarter. Does this mean that the economy is back on track, and politically will this come as a shot in the arm for the BJP on the eve of the Gujarat elections? How will all of this play out? That's what we're looking at in the next 60 minutes. But first tonight, a look at those GDP numbers. If you remember, in the last quarter, the GDP was at 5.7%, which was a 3-year low, and that was largely also because of GST and the impact of demonetization that continued to be felt. Today, the latest GDP numbers show that the economy has grown at 6.3% in the last quarter. Finance Minister Arun Jaitley spoke to reporters just a little while back on what he sees, therefore, as the road from here.
This additionally indicates that perhaps the impact of two very significant structural reforms, demonetization and the GST, is now behind us, and hopefully in the coming quarters we can look for an upwards trajectory. This quarter's positive result has been impacted significantly by the growth in manufacturing.
Well, we're going to be looking at those numbers in some detail because the overall picture certainly is an improvement from the last quarter. But if you look at the year-on-year comparison, the economy was definitely growing at a much higher rate at this time last year. So we have to ask, what are the factors that has driven it so far down, and is it going to be able to recover soon and back to the levels where it should have? And we're also going to look at specific sectors, and we'll bring up those graphics for you. For instance, areas like agriculture, which are actually seen a decline, and we will talk about that in some detail. I want to go across first to Sajid Chinoy, well-known economist with JP Morgan, joining us tonight from Mumbai. Sajid Chinoy, your thoughts on these numbers? What is the story that 6.3% GDP is telling you?
Hi Nidhi, good evening. I think the story that's telling us is that this economy is experiencing a modest cyclical recovery. There are soft spots still here. Agriculture is a soft spot. Government spending is weak. There'll be a fiscal squeeze later in the year. But perhaps the best way to assess aggregate demand in the private sector is to look at what we call gross value add and net out agriculture and government spending. Now that growth rate had fallen to 3.8% in the Jan to March quarter, right after demonetization. That's accelerated to 5.5% last quarter, and in today's number that's moved up to 6.8%, very close to the levels it was just before demonetization. So I think of this as the private sector that's recovering after these dual interventions of GST and demonetization. But the recovery, I think, from here on in will continue, but there are meaningful headwinds. I do see growth picking up, somewhere to 6.5% for the full year as a whole, but there are meaningful headwinds here, external and domestic. I think externally it's clear oil prices have moved up 20% in the last 3 months. That will significantly impinge on India's growth prospects. Global growth has been very strong, but surprisingly, India's exports have been very weak. So there are those headwinds, and domestically, as you pointed out too, agriculture, will experience some stress this year given the state of the monsoon. So to summarize, I think the good news is some of the drags from demonetization and GST are fading, and that's driving a cyclical pickup. But we're looking at meaningful headwinds from oil prices and from the deleveraging that we will embark upon in the next year or two as part of the invocation of the bankruptcy code.
Do you also believe that the fact that you also had the fiscal deficit numbers now out, and it shows that the government has actually reached 96% of its fiscal deficit target by October, is that also going to impact, you think, the numbers that come in the next quarter, because that would certainly put a strain on the government in terms of the spending that it's able to do in the next quarter?
Absolutely, Nidhi. I think that's a very big drag. I think that will show up in the Jan to March quarter. The fact is, the fiscal challenge has gotten materially bigger every month. We've had GST collections, at least for a few months, undershooting. The dividend from the RBI was less. The HRA allowance wasn't budgeted for, and a lot of spending got front-loaded this year. So the government, to be fair, is caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, if you were to sharply compress expenditures, that's going to hurt growth in the coming quarters. If you don't compress expenditures and you want to relax your fiscal deficit target this year or that year, that's going to put more pressure on borrowing costs. Already, Indian government bond yields are, the yield curve is extremely steep. So, I sympathize with the government. It's a difficult trade-off here. And to be fair, some of this is induced by GST. So, in a way, think of this as, short-term pain, hopefully for medium-term benefits that'll throw up.
All right, so interesting how you've summed it up. Modest gains for the economy. You're saying the drag, some of that drag from the GST and the demonetization is faded, but there, as you put it, are meaningful headwinds that are around the corner which will create problems. Professor Arun Kumar, then let me come to you. And you have, of course, consistently argued that you feel this entire calculation of GDP is flawed because it doesn't take the unorganized sector into account. But what does this 6.3 versus 5.7 from the last quarter tell you?
See, both demonetization and GST did not impact the organized sector so much. And therefore, if the organized sector is doing somewhat better than what it did in the previous quarter, then that's to be expected. Second is that these figures, the quarterly figures, get revised. And at times they've got revised negatively also. So it's possible that as more data comes in, these figures could get revised negatively, because these figures that have come are for the July to September. And that is when the GST impact was the strongest. So therefore, it's quite likely, and given the latest GST collection data, it seems even the organized sector got impacted negatively by the GST. So it's possible that that would also get revised, lower figures. So I think the jury is still out as to whether this 6.3 is reliable. Second point I'd like to make is that 6.3 compared to last year's figure, it was expected to be lower because that was the pre-demonetization period. This is the post-demonetization, post-GST period. So therefore, this was expected to be lower. But if the organized sector data is taken into account, and that's 45% of the GDP, if you include agriculture in it, then if 45% is still, say, minus 10%, then your growth rate is roughly close to zero rather than anywhere close to 6.3%. So that would be something that would affect the economy quite consistently. And that's why you see farmers protesting, you see youth protesting, you see other sectors from the unorganized sector like traders protesting.
And there are strains, for example, even on jobs and so on, which, which are still issues that need to be looked at. And Sunil Alag, let me take that to you. Sunil, what do you take away from this? Also, I'm just going to read out some political reactions that have come in. I mean, Suresh Prabhu, of course, is thrilled. He says the fundamentals of the Indian economy are getting stronger, and he's even talked about aiming for a 10% GDP. I think the finance minister said that it would actually be very difficult to achieve a 10% GDP, but Suresh Prabhu is confident. Chidambaram says, I'm happy that the growth is 6.3, but this is a pause in the declining trend of the last 5 quarters. He says you have to wait and see what the next 3 or 4 quarters are like to reach a definite conclusion about the way the economy is heading. Sunil.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, I've been on your show and I've been very optimistic. I've been telling you from the beginning that, look, the GDP growth is bound to go up because the FMCG sector is moving up, the auto sector was moving up. Now, industrial growth has grown substantially even in this 6.3%. I think it's reached almost 4.9 when it was floundering at 1.3 or something. And people have said the organized, unorganized sector, something is going to get knocked around. Look, I have said that not only this, wait till the budget in February. I expect people to have more money in their hands because if more money is coming into the government, they're going to spend more on infrastructure. All the jobs and all I've been saying is going to be from April 2018 onwards. So I see a lot of promise in whatever is happening. Unless, of course, we have a bad monsoon next year, I don't see anything declining. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's going to be either where it is or it's going to move up. I don't understand how anybody is saying that the next 6 months is going to be lower than what we've achieved already. And this is going to be attracting FDI, whether you take... See, I've been saying demonetization is over. Okay, GS...
No, I'm sorry. I just wanted to ask you, what about the headwinds that Sajid Chinoy was talking about, whether it's weak exports, oil prices, the fact that the agricultural sector is actually down and it's gone down again in this quarter. Given all of that, those are challenges certainly for the economy.
No, look, No, I fully agree that agriculture has to be looked at, but agriculture was never affected by GST, so let's not blame GST for agricultural growth now.
affected by
And
demonetization.
I don't see oil prices going beyond $60, $50 to $60. So if we think it's going to be in that zone and it's going to be stable around that zone, then there's no reason why now the focus will be on the agricultural sector and everything else. It's like saying, you know, we've scored, your boy scores 100 runs and you say, well, the fielding was bad and the bowling was bad, but let's celebrate what is happening today. That's all I say. Look, we are moving in the right direction, and if we are still going to be pessimistic, well, then there's no future as far as we are concerned. I've always been optimistic, and I'll be back on your show after October, November, December, and I can guarantee you it will be a higher growth rate than 6.3.
So
no
Venu,
question in my mind.
So Venu, should we be looking at
And we
this?
have to focus on agriculture, but
Yeah.
all the money that is being spent on infra will generate employment.
Okay, so let me take
You know,
what you're
that's
saying.
where we are looking
What
at.
Sunil Alagh is saying is, look at where we were in the last quarter and look at where we are today. It's certainly an improvement. Manufacturing is certainly showing an uptick. You can see that although it was 7.7% last year at this time, it's down to 7%, but it was 1.2% in the last quarter. Yeah. So manufacturing has seen quite a big change. Agriculture is a concern, construction is a concern. These are all areas where we've seen a decline. But Venu, shouldn't we be looking at the fact that in the last quarter, overall the indices were much worse than this?
Yeah, Nidhi, see what has happened, if you look at data for the last 4-5 quarters, it's been consistently been declining. So there was a bottoming out in the quarter reported April to
Even before
July.
demonetization, it was declining.
Yeah, and in between you had demonetization GST. Now there is a marginal improvement now, but mind you, if you see the data, agriculture is bad, construction sector is still very sluggish, and these are the two biggest employment providers in the economy, agriculture and construction. And as Sajid said, I agree with Sajid, all the GST issues have not been resolved, and the chief statistician at a press conference, he said that some of this data may have to be revised, because if GST collections are lower than, which is what looks like now, than expected, budgeted, then the GDP may have to be revised downwards, right? And similarly, sales tax, which is also now subsumed to GST, which impacts the gross value out in the trading sector. So if sales tax are lower than what has been assumed, so there are a lot of ifs. So this 6.3 should not be taken as, I think it's a bit early to celebrate, but there seems to be a bottoming out in the manufacturing. That much seems to be there, but I'm not sure whether it is employment providing manufacturing or it is jobless manufacturing, because in my view, I still feel agriculture and construction are the biggest employment providers, and both of them are sluggish. And finally, Nidhi, data also shows that gross fixed capital formation, which is an indication of investment in the economy, it is even lower as a ratio of GDP. It's gone further down, and there is no sign that investments are picking up. So
I want you to explain something to our viewers very simply. What is GVA? Because a lot of people, and just explain it to us very simply, because the GVA numbers, a lot of people are tweeting about that and talking about that. Why are those numbers important? What does that mean? And what story are they telling us?
GVA is essentially, very simply put, GVA is a new methodology that the government adopted, and this is based on IMF and other multilateral bodies, and it simply means value added by the
so it means
by
profits and wages.
Sector,
profits and wages in the economy constitute gross value added.
So what do the GVA numbers tell you?
So GVA numbers tell you what are it that the wage earners are earning and the profit earners are earning, and the GDP means include the subsidies.
So this time's GVA numbers are telling you what?
So this time GVA's numbers are telling you they're slightly better than what it was earlier, but not necessarily compared to last year. And also this is for the organized sector, because the data comes only for the organized sector, and we can't assume that unorganized sector the same thing is happening. Okay, so the GVA numbers are also for the organized sector only, and the methodology for calculation shows that we are assuming that the unorganized sector is growing at the same rate as the organized sector. That is where the methodology is incorrect.
No, wait, before I get Nilanjan and the political panelists into this, I do want to ask Sajid one more question on, I think what matters the most to people, Sajid Chinoy, is just, the issue of jobs. And that continues to be a big concern. Now you have the CMIE, which in its latest data, released in October, said that urban unemployment in India was at 8.2%, the highest in the last 11 months. That labor participation rate was rising, and that labor is returning to markets, but they're not finding jobs post demonetization. What is this data telling you, and how real is the job scare in the near future?
Nidhi, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer just because we don't have good data. So, all of us are shooting in the dark. A lot of these are surveys, but we don't have systematic data on the job market in India. So, it's really hard to put a finger on where the unemployment rate today is. The best proxy that I have is actually looking at rural wages. The government gives us incredibly disaggregated rural wages by profession on a monthly basis. And there, frankly, the news is not that bad. If in fact there had been substantial unemployment for any length of time, that should have over time at least depressed rural wages as unemployment rose. We've seen that rural wages aren't great. They aren't what they were 5 years ago, 6 years ago, but they haven't fallen off as sharply as one would have thought. So I'm still hopeful here that the job situation is not significantly worse than it was a year ago. But beyond using proxies like wages, we don't have good data on actual jobs. The last thing I will say is Venu's exactly right that the agriculture and construction are the two sectors that are most kind of labor intensive. Also, some of our exports are quite labor intensive, textile, leather, gems and jewelry, and those haven't picked up in this global environment, which is quite surprising and puzzling. But the hope again is that the private sector demand is picking up. We're at 6.8% today. We were at 5% a quarter ago, 3% 2 quarters ago. So the hope is if that sustains for a few quarters, this should eventually at least spill over to construction at some point in time. So that's what we have to hold out hope for.
Well, let me get into the politics of it, and this should be fun. Rajiv Gowda is joining us from the Congress party. And Rajiv, I just heard that Ghulam Nabi Azad has called the new GDP numbers a political stunt. Although, how is that a political stunt? These are numbers. And, you guys had things to say on the 5.7% growth rate. Now it's 6.3%. But that doesn't equal it into becoming a political stunt. How do you see these numbers, Rajiv?
Nidhi, I am actually very relieved to see that the economy is picking up again. See, the innate strength of the Indian economy would predict a 7%, 8% growth rate. It takes a special genius to mess with that kind of trajectory and put us into that hole which got us to 5.7%, thanks to that genius of Prime Minister Modi and Finance Minister Jaitley. Now, Mr. Azad is probably referring to the fact that this slight uptick, which after a few quarters of downturn is being projected as some dramatic turnaround, this is something that we have to wait and watch. We hope that the actual economy will pick up and move forward. And anything else is headline management and spin, and that seems like a political stunt. But fundamentally, look at the sides, the portions of the sections of the economy that are still hurting. Look at agriculture, look at construction. These are huge job-generating sectors. You look at exports and how they're still fairly tepid. If this is the case, when the overall global economy is picking up, where India's exports should also be picking up, there again we see that GST's bad implementation could probably have had an impact. And the factor that we have not talked about enough is the informal sector, the jobs that are out there. You're seeing this on the ground, say in Surat, where even traders are out protesting. Certainly the farmers in Gujarat are really angry. Why? Because they've been left behind. And this growth story is ensuring that people are in distress on the farm, distress in the small and medium enterprise sector, distress in the construction sector, and people are saying, what happened to those promised jobs? And it doesn't
Rajiv,
look like
what the headlines will be tomorrow
change that dramatically. We can only hope for that.
No, I'm saying the headlines tomorrow in the newspapers are going to say economy bounces back. Shot in the arm for Modi government after ease of doing business rankings, after Moody's ratings, and that on the eve of the Gujarat election, the perception will be that things are picking up again. And do you think that politically that's crucial? The perception is crucial. I mean, whatever the reality may be, but there is a perception war that is very real.
Nidhi, you yourself mentioned that jobs are crucial, right? And people are concerned about not GDP numbers or GVA numbers. They're concerned about what does this mean to me. You're telling me that the economy is bouncing back. It's not something that I experience in my life because my jobs are not being created. People are going back to their villages and relying on Manrega wages to survive. And those were record numbers last year. So the people's experience. Look at the situation on the farm. Agricultural prices have come down dramatically. So the yield to the farmer is also very low. So they're going to say, what mujhko kya mila? What has happened to me in all this?
Prime Minister Modi is telling us a good story. He's very good at that.
What is the story with me?
Okay, so Ejaz, is this something you think that is going to come as a shot in the arm politically ahead of elections, or at the end of the day, as Rajiv says, will it matter to people on the ground, farmers in particular, those in the agricultural sector who are in distress and to whom GDP numbers may not mean anything?
Initially, let me give you a political response to what my friend Rajiv Gowda said and what Mr. Chidambaram spoke about and what Mr. Ghulam Nabi Azad said. All these predictions of doomsday scenario, they've been relegated completely. All the people, the naysayers that the economy has been totally demolished by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and demonetization and GST and we can't recover ever, they've been relegated to bystanders. Thirdly, all these predictors of apocalypse now, they must be actually wondering why this bounce back has happened. Let's see it as a bottoming out. Let's see this as a positive trend reversal. Let's see a directional uptick that is taking place, and that what was anticipated that a couple of quarters will be difficult post two transformative difficult steps taken for the first time in this country by the Prime Minister and his government was demonetization and GST would have its pain. But let's hope the pain is definitely over and these numbers, the rise in the manufacturing sector, mining sector, quarry sector, let's look at the positives also rather than decrying and being naysayers and doomsday predictors and predictors of apocalypse. Let's be considerate enough that it's not only about the Prime Minister. If the GDP is showing an uptake, it's a relief for the country that we together as Team India have our roles and we have done a transformative step which can become better in the future. Yes, the issue of jobs, obviously a positive manufacturing data, a sharp uptick will reflect in jobs in the future. One more thing, Nidhi, I must add to you. We can't compare year-on-year comparisons on the economic figures that earlier there was this last quarter. If you just compare quarter 1, quarter 2 post demonetization from 5.6 to 6.3 is a 9.5% jump from quarter 1 to quarter 2 post demonetization. That is also to be considered in a positive fashion.
The funny thing is that Venu was reminding me just before we went on air that Surjit Bhalla, who was with us, I think the last time when we were discussing the GDP numbers, was arguing, or some other numbers. But anyway,
pre-demonetization, post-demonetization.
So he was arguing that year on year is the way to go, and that's the comparison that has to be made. Yeah. So if you look at it year, I'm just saying what Surjit Bhalla said. I'm not saying it. I'm just saying what Surjit
Bhalla said. We can't compare year on year.
But he's the advisor to the Prime Minister, not me. I'm only pointing out what he said. And at this time last year we were 7.4% and now we're 6.3%. But before I come back to that, Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay has just come back from Gujarat and has been writing about what he has seen there. How do you think this will play out politically? I ask you the same question because the headlines will be this tomorrow, that there is a turnaround, that this is a big achievement for the government, and certainly you can't say there isn't a turnaround. Obviously things at some level are picking up. It may not be the levels we want it to be, but it's there.
Nidhi, the people, whether in Gujarat or in Uttar Pradesh or in any other state, they do not react the way Dalal Street does. It takes a long time for figures to start having an impact on public sentiment. For 5 quarters, figures have been slipping. But it has taken only in the last 3 months has there been an instance where there has been some kind of a public anger coming up. So if there is a positive turn, which other panelists have been talking about, I do not think that political dividend will come immediately. It would come possibly only towards the end of 2018. So and provided it is of course sustained. Yeah. So as far as Gujarat is concerned, I do not think these kind of figures is going to work. It of course is going to give great talking points to friends like Ejaz, to leaders of the BJP who are going to campaign. I am sure that Mr. Modi is going to talk about these figures in the next round of speeches that he delivers in Gujarat. You have to also understand that in Gujarat there is across classes, there is some kind of a resentment. It's not just that it's a partidar or just a farmer agitation. There are various reasons. I am not an agricultural economist, to be able to argue, but it's not agriculture is not just linked to GST. The fact is that people feel that the prices are not remunerative enough. So there is something fundamentally wrong in the agricultural economy. Gujarat registered quite a bit of agricultural growth during Mr. Modi's chief ministership, and I think that there is not enough pickup of what they are producing at the prices at which they would want. There have been several cases where people pointed that we are getting even lower than what was the MSP during the UPA tenure. Various farmers have their list of was ready for people who are willing to listen to it. Gujarat also is predominantly a cash economy. There is a huge cash economy. For instance, you have tea, for instance, this very famous chai wala is such integral to Gujarat's economy as well as the political discourse. There are tea makers who have as much as 50,000 rupees per day of sales. Now, there is a problem at various levels. So all these are not being addressed, and I do not think that in any way this is going to have any effect in terms of erasing the anger or the anguish which the people have on in such a short period.
Sunil, let me take that to you, because you're saying what Ejaz is saying, that there are people who are naysayers who keep painting a doomsday scenario about the economy. But if you look at agriculture and construction in particular, where a large chunk of employment comes from in this country, the fact that these two sectors are down, in agriculture in particular, isn't that something that has to be really red flagged as a serious concern, and that this distress on the ground doesn't square up? I mean, that it may not matter to farmers when a 6.3 number is thrown at them. They won't care if they're under distress.
I look. Yeah, I don't deny the fact that agriculture needs to improve, but you've got to take a look at the base figure, and the growth this year has also got to be taken into account rather than merely looking at it in terms of as a comparison. Last year we had a very high growth, and this year we are taking it on a much higher level. But that aside, if the way everybody is talking right now, then Gujarat BJP should lose, and lose handsomely, the way I'm hearing everybody saying, including Mr. Mukhopadhyay, that look, there's a lot of angst and everybody else. So the elections are going to be next month. Fair enough. We'll find out whether the angst is real or whether the angst is not real. Most importantly, in agriculture and employment, I have been saying all along the employment needs to be looked at. But what kind of employment are we going to generate? Look, the money on infrastructure is just about being spent. It's going to take us 3 to 6 months before all the roads and all the bridges and all the ports, and that's where the employment will be generated. Either we say, look, suddenly now the country is moving quarter to quarter. We always criticize that one quarter result should not be taken in a country's thing. All I'm saying is, look, the infrastructure spending has begun. Employment will get generated in the 6 months. I'm not predicting what's going to happen in Gujarat, but the way it's sounding, and Mr. Gowda says 6.3% is a bad figure. If it was 5.3, he would have believed the figures. If it is 6.3, he says, look, it's a dressing up. There are areas, look, but I'm just saying the trend is upwards. People are beginning to understand that the nation is moving up. There's been an effort on the part of Mr. Modi to try and say, I'm going to try and make the economy and the people a little more honest. It's going to take us time. There has to be a dip when you want to have such a substantial change in the attitude of the people. That's all I'm saying. Of course, there are things to be done. No question.
Whether we are a more honest
nation, people believe it's going to happen in 6 months, they'll vote for
Whether we
him.
are a more honest country is a debate, I think a separate debate, and we can continue to spar on that. But one second, I just want to go across to Arvind Panagriya, who joins us live tonight. The former Vice Chairman of the Niti Aayog is joining us this evening. And Mr. Panagriya, thank you for being with us. You're joining us via Skype, so thanks for that. Sir, your first sort of reading of this latest GDP figure, what is it telling you? What's the big picture it's telling you?
So, 2 or 3 points, Nidhi. First of all, it is a good news. We have now bottomed out in the first quarter of this fiscal, so we are now turning back up. Also, I'm very pleased actually that the recovery is very much private sector led. If you look at the figures of the final consumption of the government, that has grown in real terms only 4.1% compared with about 16.5% a year ago for the same quarter. Also, if you see the private corporate manufacturing growth in nominal terms about over 11%, overall manufacturing growth 7%. So these are all signs to me that this is private sector-led recovery rather than the government-led recovery, and that is something we have been waiting for. So that's the one big point. The second point is that this is happening now currently, with a lot of restructuring that is going on. And to be able to maintain a growth rate of even 6.3% during a time when so much restructuring of the economy is happening should be generally quite satisfactory, actually. So it's not the situation that we had in 2012, 13 and 13, 14, when there was no restructuring happening, a lot of loans were being given to the private investors, and yet the growth rate had actually during those 2 years dipped to something like an average of 5.9% over those 2 years. So with restructuring, growing at 6.3%, I think that's pretty reasonable. We should do better in the second half of the fiscal year.
What are your areas of concern, though, Mr. Panagria? Sajid Chinoy was just talking to us about, I think by and large saying that, this is a modest sort of recovery, but he's talked about meaningful headwinds, such as the agricultural sector, oil prices, exports still being weak. Would you largely concur with that, these are areas that will still be a big cause of concern? And what about employment? Because, again, in order to meet the kind of jobs that have been promised, we would have to have a much higher GDP, I think closer to 8% in order to generate those kind of jobs. So are these the areas you would concur are areas of concern?
So I concur. These are areas of concern. Exports, agriculture, clearly areas of concern. On jobs, though, my take tends to be a little different. I just don't believe that when all the claims that say that, this is a jobless recovery, when you are growing at, so in the 3 years, full fiscal years of this present government, growth has been 7.5%. Productivity growth can contribute at most maybe 3 percentage points out of that. So 4.5 percentage points growth has to be coming from the growth in the inputs. Inputs are largely capital and labor. Capital growth has not been greatly robust. It's been decent, but it's not been greatly robust. So I just don't see that without labor having simultaneously grown at a pretty decent pace, this could have happened. So I think jobs are being created. More labor is being used by the economy. Now, the real problem with the job side, in my view, is the creation of good jobs, jobs that give you high productivity, jobs for which the wages are decent. I think that is our major problem. And this all goes back to the underemployment in the economy. It's not so much the employment that is a problem in the country, but it's underemployment. People are doing something, but they are not employed so gainfully. Often, the way I put it is that a job that can be done generally by one person is being done by 2 or 3 people, and that is the kind of slack in the job market that needs to be cleaned up. And for that, the solutions are a little different than we conventionally think.
But Mr. Panagria, I think the point that's also been made by other economists is that the GDP numbers don't take the unorganized sector into account, that the impact of demonetization was felt the most in those sectors. Professor Arun Kumar is here in the studio with us, and he's repeatedly made that point. In which case, how do we really measure what our growth is if the unorganized sector has been hit so badly, and the agricultural sector also, which are, what explains that 1.7% in this quarter, down from even 2.3% in the last quarter?
No, let me clear this out. That this continuously comes that we don't measure unorganized sector. That's not true. Unorganized sector is very much measured as a part of the GDP figures. So I mentioned, for example, the private corporate sector, but then the non-corporate private sector includes a lot of the informal sector employment also. The enterprises that are less than 10 workers are counted, own account enterprises are counted. So it's not that they are not counted. Perhaps we don't do as good a job as we should be doing. But having said that, remember that we are looking at the growth in. So, unless the measurement metric is changing over time in a big way, and so therefore, the figures are not comparable over different time periods, which I don't think is the case. Growth rates still, so we are measuring the informal sector GDP or unorganized sector GDP in a sort of with larger error. But I think growth in it perhaps is impacted less. I mean, the error in that measurement, in the measurement of the growth, is probably less. So that is my answer on the unorganized. So please,
Mr. Chidambaram tweeted that he's happy that it's 6.3%, but he believes it's a pause in the declining trend of the last 5 quarters, and he should wait to look at growth rates over the next 3 to 4 quarters before we can reach a definite conclusion on which way the Indian economy is headed. What would you say?
Yes, I think that's broadly okay. I think we should not in a big way start celebrating in a way, but we should be cautious, and I'll be looking for the figures in the coming quarters. But the signs generally look good to me, because the reason I feel optimistic is that this is really turned around in the private sector, and manufacturing also has done well. So 7% growth in manufacturing is very, very good. A couple of percentage point out of that may be restocking of the inventory. But even then, getting 5% out of 5 out of the 7% from extra growth, I think that's very good. So I remain optimistic. We should see the economy continue to rise up. But at the same time, I agree also with Mr. Chidambaram that we should be cautiously watching what goes on in the next 3 or 4 quarters.
All right. Well, Mr. Panagria, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you very much.